5 years had passed since the last time I spoke to my brother. And now, after everything that had happened, my family was asking me to help him when he had hit rock bottom. It all started when my marriage crumbled. I was 36 at the time, and my ex-husband, Martin, 34, and I had been together for nearly 6 years, married for 2. We were supposed to be in this together, but he shattered that illusion. After confessing to an affair with a coworker, right after our second anniversary, I was devastated. He begged for another chance, promising he wanted to work on our marriage. But the damage was done. How could I even look at him the same way again? After weeks of agony, I asked him to move out, and just like that, our marriage ended. He didn't fight it. Instead, he found solace in the arms of the woman he had betrayed me with, marrying her shortly after the divorce was finalized. They moved away to Philadelphia, starting their life together, while I was left to pick up the pieces of mine. But the ripple effects didn't stop there. The affair wasn't just the end of my marriage, it also tore apart the bond one shared with my brother, Nick. He had been close friends with Martin before I ever even met him. In fact, it was through Nick that I met Martin. So when my marriage unraveled, I thought my brother, of all people, would understand and stand by me. But to my shock, he didn't. Nick already knew about the divorce, and the worst part? Martin had confided in him long before I told the rest of the family. And his advice to me? To give Martin another shot. To stay with a man who had betrayed me so deeply. I was stunned, the shock turning into anger. How could he suggest that? Did he really think I should forgive Martin? I told him there was no way I was staying with a man who had hurt me so badly. But it didn't stop there. I expected him to at least understand why I was hurt and take my side. Instead, Nick decided that he was going to stay neutral, still in touch with Martin, as though nothing had changed. I couldn't believe it. It felt like he was choosing Martin over me. He argued that their friendship was too important to him to sever over something that was between Martin and me. But that wasn't good enough for me. My heart ached, and I made it clear he couldn't have both. He had to choose. Either he stayed loyal to me, his sister, or he kept his friendship with Martin. But he didn't choose me. No, he chose to maintain his friendship with Martin, even telling me I was being petty and immature for expecting him to pick sides. I was crushed. It was as though I didn't matter to him. As if the years of shared memories and family bonds meant nothing. It was devastating. From that point on, we didn't speak. And to make matters worse, Nick even attended Martin's wedding to the woman he had been having an affair with. That was the final straw. I couldn't even look at him anymore. For 5 long years, we have barely exchanged a word. Sure, we both show up to family gatherings, holidays, weddings, but we pretend like the other doesn't exist. There's nothing to say. My parents, however, haven't given up on the idea of reconciliation. They keep trying to fix things between us, but I'm resolute. We've both made it clear where we stand. I keep hearing from them about the major milestones in Nick's life, his new business, his success in the graphic design world. But it's hard to feel anything for him after all that's happened. And then, out of nowhere, a call from my parents shakes me. Nick is in trouble. His business, which had seemed to be thriving, is now in chaos. Debt is piling up, and he's been evicted from his apartment. I could hardly believe it. He's lost everything. But what really stung was that my parents were reaching out to me for help. Nick wouldn't ask them for anything, too proud to go back home or even accept their financial assistance. So now, they were hoping I could offer him a place to stay. He's been crashing at his girlfriend's place, but with roommates, there's only so much space. He's on borrowed time there. It was heartbreaking, but I couldn't help him. I didn't owe him anything. I wasn't about to step in and fix his mess, especially after how he had treated me. I made it clear to my parents that I wouldn't reach out to him, that I wasn't interested in trying to reconnect after 5 years of silence. They didn't take it well. They begged, told me I was being selfish. They tried to guilt me, claiming that my ego had already ruined our relationship once and that if I didn't act now, I was making the same mistake again. They said I needed to think about Nick, to help him in his time of need. But I couldn't. The thought of reaching out to him weighed heavily on my mind. In the past, when we were on better terms, he had looked up to me, almost idolized me. But now, I could sense that they were trying to pull me into an emotional manipulation game. I could feel the pressure building, but I wasn't fooled. I wasn't about to let it work. I had made up my mind, and I wasn't going to bend. I decided against reaching out to my brother. I took some time to think it through, spoke to a few friends, and went over the comments on my post. To my surprise, everyone seemed to share the same sentiment. They all agreed that what my brother had done in the past was not just wrong, but deeply disrespectful. So no, I didn't owe him anything. He hadn't even asked for my help, and that made the decision even clearer. If he wanted something from me, if he reached out first, then maybe we could have a conversation. But until then, I wasn't going to jump through hoops just because my parents thought I should. For days had passed since my last conversation with them, and this morning, I decided it was time to call. I needed them to know where I stood. For days, they had bombarded me with calls and messages, constantly asking if I'd spoken to Nick yet. Today, I couldn't take it any longer. I told them to stop. I wasn't going to do what they wanted, and it was time they accepted that. When I stood my ground, they didn't just back off. Instead, they shifted tactics, becoming more manipulative. They told me I was the only one who could fix this, that it was my responsibility. I let them know, loud and clear, that I didn't care if I was the only one who could help. This wasn't my problem to solve. I wasn't going to get dragged into this mess. Then came the argument. My parents insisted that because Nick was my brother, his problems were my problems too. They thought family meant carrying each other's burdens, but if that was the case, why didn't they feel the same way when Nick and I were fighting about Martin? By their logic, if Martin had cheated on me and caused chaos in my life, shouldn't Nick have been the first one to cut him out of his life? But no, now, suddenly, I was the one expected to bear the weight of Nick's mess, while they conveniently ignored their own double standards. I asked them why they didn't feel the same when I was dealing with Martin. They had no answer. Instead, they accused me of twisting their words, of using excuses not to help. They painted me as selfish, disgraceful. It was as if they were trying to force me to take the blame for everything. But I wasn't having it. If being selfish meant standing up for myself, then I was fine with that label. I told them I was done. I didn't want to hear from them anymore. But it didn't end there. My mother had to take it further. In a tone laced with venom, she told me that she had always known I had a massive ego and that maybe, just maybe, Nick had been right to choose Martin over me. My heart sank. Everyone knew how much that statement hurt me. It was my sore spot, the one thing I couldn't handle. And she knew it. She knew how deeply that would cut, and she said it anyway. It was deliberate, and it worked. It felt like a punch to the gut. I snapped. I couldn't let her get away with it. I forgot about everything, the need to stay calm, the decision to end the conversation. I shouted at her, my voice shaking with anger. How could she say that when she knew what had happened with Martin and Nick wasn't right? There was no justifying it, no excuse. She tried to defend herself, saying she knew what Nick had done was wrong, but now, based on my actions, she wasn't so sure. She even suggested that maybe it had been the right choice for Nick to side with Martin. It was too much. The frustration boiled over, and I lost myself in the heat of the moment. My parents were blind to everything, so wrapped up in their own misguided view of what was right that they couldn't see how hurtful their words were. But I didn't care. I wanted to scream until they admitted they were wrong. The argument dragged on for what felt like an eternity. 15 minutes, maybe longer, of accusations flying back and forth. They called me selfish. I called them disrespectful. They insisted that all they wanted was for me to care about Nick's issues. I told them they didn't care about mine, and that was the problem. In the end, I couldn't take it anymore. I told them I never wanted to speak to them again, that I was done. And with that, I hung up and blocked their numbers, not wanting to leave any room for further contact. The next few days were a blur. I was trying to find some peace, some space to breathe. I texted a few friends to vent, and they agreed with me. They said I had every right to block them. That I should just ignore them if they tried to contact me again. They had made their priorities clear, and it was time for me to focus on my own life. After everything, I'd given them more time and energy than they deserved. I had enough. A week passed. No contact. I thought it was over, that they would finally back off. But today, when I pulled up to my house after work, I saw them. Sitting there, outside my front door, waiting. It was the last thing I expected, and I wasn't in the mood for it. I had just come from a grueling day, and I was exhausted. I honked my horn twice, then told them to get lost, or I'd call the cops. But instead of leaving, they approached my car, asking to talk. They claimed they didn't want to fight, but that I just needed to come out and give them some time. I wasn't having it. I promised them I'd unblock them later, that we could talk then, but right now, I needed my space. That's when they dropped the bombshell. Nick had moved back in with them. Apparently, his girlfriend had kicked him out after the 2 weeks were up. She told him her roommates wouldn't let him stay any longer, and now he had nowhere else to go. This was just the beginning, but I could feel the storm brewing. It wasn't long before I realized the depths they were willing to go. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. My parents stood there, their words relentless. It was clear they didn't care about my feelings anymore. They were only concerned about getting what they needed. And when they told me they weren't there to talk about Nick anymore, that didn't ease the sting. They didn't even mention his name directly, they were there for my money. Retirement had taken its toll on them. The years of hard work behind them, they couldn't afford to keep covering for him. As a parent, they expected me to step in. But my answer, as blunt as it might have seemed, was firm. I wasn't going to talk to Nick, nor would I let him live with me. They were asking me for financial help, though. They needed it. Nick was back in their home, and their modest income couldn't support him and themselves, let alone worry about their future. They seemed to think that I owed them, that after everything they had done for me, it was now my turn to return the favor. I felt the weight of their expectations press down on me, but I wasn't ready to make such a heavy decision on the spot. I was exhausted, emotionally drained from a long day of work. I wasn't ready to commit. The pressure mounting on me, their voices rising with urgency, made me more frustrated by the minute. I asked for time, trying to gather my thoughts, trying to process what they were asking from me. But instead of giving me that space, they pushed harder, insisting I owed them this, and that I needed to do it right now. I couldn't take it anymore. Furious, I stepped out of the car. They needed to understand, and I made sure they knew I wasn't bluffing. My patience had run out, and I told them in no uncertain terms that they needed to leave or I would call the cops. Their laughter, thinking I was only threatening them, infuriated me even more. I gave them one last chance to walk away, but they didn't. So, I did what I said I would. I called the cops right there, in front of them, watching as their faces shifted from disbelief to shock. But even then, they couldn't let it go. Instead of retreating, they decided to stand their ground, arguing with me until the police arrived. It was like they had no idea how far I was willing to go. And when the officers had to drag them away, I realized it was over. They were gone from my life, for good. I blocked them on every platform, cutting ties for good. The weight lifted, but it wasn't enough to give me peace. I knew what was coming. I had to take legal action. I spoke with my lawyer, and we agreed it was time to file for a restraining order. This wasn't just about my parents anymore. It was about taking control of my life. The harassment, the pressure, the endless demands, they had to end. My peace, my mental health, was at stake. So, we filed. But that was just the beginning. The very next day, strange things started happening. I began receiving calls from unknown numbers. Every time I answered, silence followed, only for the call to end abruptly. It felt eerie, like a shadow stalking me, but I wasn't about to let them get away with it. I blocked one number after another, but it didn't stop. It escalated. They started sending messages, taunting me with threats, reminding me that I would pay the price for my actions. It wasn't just the words. It was the rage, the spite that seeped through every message. They called me selfish, ungrateful, things I hadn't heard since childhood. But this time, it wasn't just talk. It was manipulation, a calculated effort to make me feel guilty, to drag me back into their web. But I saw through it. I knew it was them. It had to be. The decision was clear. I couldn't just sit back anymore. I'd been silent for so long, respecting the family ties, but this wasn't family anymore. It was toxic, and I wasn't going to be their punching bag. My lawyer agreed this had gone too far. We filed the restraining order, hoping it would finally give me the protection I needed. I couldn't let them drag me down again, not after everything I had been through. Things calmed down for a while, but I should have known better than to think it was over. A few weeks later, my brother reached out. Nick. The same Nick who had always seemed to play the victim. The message he sent me, it was exactly what I expected. He called me out for taking such extreme action against our parents. He wanted to remind me that they had done everything for us. He accused me of being disrespectful, of throwing away everything they had done for us. I was beyond furious. I had had enough of this act. I fired back, pointing out how easy it was for him to talk about what they did for him, when they were clearly bending over backward to help him out. I wasn't the one they were helping anymore. I wasn't the one they were pestering for money. But Nick, as always, played it off, denying he had ever asked me for help. He didn't want me to blame him, but I couldn't help it. He had no idea how much they had pushed me. I tried to set the record straight, telling him everything that had happened. He didn't take it well, though. He hung up immediately, and I was left with the familiar taste of frustration. Still, I wasn't surprised. Nick had always been naive, always caught up in his own world, unaware of the chaos our parents caused. It didn't take long for the word to get out. My parents had been going to other relatives, crying about how I had ruined everything, how I had poisoned my relationship with everyone, including Nick. They were trying to turn the family against me. But as more people found out the truth, they started to see things differently. They realized it wasn't just me making bad decisions, it was my parents who had pushed me to this point. And finally, they apologized. By then, the damage had been done. My parents were now the ones isolated, ostracized by the very people they had once counted on. I couldn't say they didn't deserve it. They had put me through hell, and I was done letting them control my life. I didn't regret taking the stand I did. But as for Nick, well, we were still no contact. And I didn't see that changing anytime soon. Until he realized what he had done, there was no point in trying to mend things. He wasn't ready to admit his mistakes, just like our parents. But as long as my life was going well, I wasn't going to let it bother me anymore. The future was mine to shape, and I wasn't about to let anyone stand in my way.